A dusty ledger, a colonial law nobody wanted passed, and a paper trail that was never supposed to survive long enough for you to read it. If you carry one of these 15 surnames, your last name is not just something your family picked up along the way, it is a receipt. And starting in 1817, the British government accidentally created the single most important document for tracing it back. Here's what most people never got told. In 1816, colonial authorities in Jamaica passed a law forcing every enslaver on the island to register every single person they held in bondage. Name, age, where they were born, African or Creole, every 3 years on the record, in writing. The law wasn't passed out of kindness. It was passed to stop illegal smuggling after the transatlantic trade was banned. But it left behind something nobody intended, the closest thing to a census that enslaved Jamaicans ever got. Names, numbers, estates, parishes, a paper trail that runs in an unbroken line from 1817 almost to emancipation itself. For 2 centuries, those registers just sat in colonial archives looking like bureaucracy. Then genealogists started digitizing them. DNA databases got big enough to matter, and researchers began matching modern test results against the actual estates listed on those pages. The patterns that came out were staggering. Certain names cluster on certain estates bought from certain African regions over and over for decades. And when you follow that trail all the way down, a lot of Jamaican families are finding out that the plantation owner's surname they inherited was sitting directly on top of a specific African nation the entire time. These are 15 of those surnames, counting down to the one researchers call the most Jamaican name in the world. Stick around. The top 3 will genuinely surprise you. Before we get into it, if your family name shows up anywhere on this list, drop it in the comments with the parish your people are from. We're building a map in real time, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that combination, your name plus your parish, is the key that unlocks everything else. Hit subscribe while you're at it, because we break down a new set of Caribbean surnames and their African origins every week, and you don't want to miss the one your own name is hiding in. All right, let's get into it. Number 15, Campbell. Campbell is about as Scottish as a surname gets, a Highland clan name, full stop, and that's exactly the clue. Jamaica had one of the heaviest concentrations of Scottish plantation owners anywhere in the empire, so heavy that by the late 1700s, roughly a third of all white men on the island were estimated to be Scots. Highland clans like the Campbells didn't just send a few sons to the Caribbean. Entire branches of the family relocated to run sugar estates in Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth. Those estates bought in bulk, and they bought consistently from the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, because Akan captives had a reputation among planters for agricultural skill and physical endurance. That reputation came at a price the planters rarely talked about. Akan-descended communities were also the backbone of nearly every major uprising the island ever saw. So when black Jamaican Campbells test today, the Akan signal from Ghana comes back disproportionately strong, a Highland clan name sitting on top of one of the most rebellious ancestries in the entire Caribbean. Not a bad place to start. But the next one hides its story even better. Number 14. Palmer began as an English word for a pilgrim, someone who'd carried a palm frond back from the Holy Land. Ordinary, almost pious. But in Jamaica, the name is inseparable from one address, Rose Hall Estate in St. James, and the legend of Annie Palmer, the so-called White Witch of Rose Hall, said to have terrorized the enslaved people under her control. Legend aside, the estate's real registers tell a plainer and darker story. Rose Hall drew heavily from the Bight of Biafra, Igbo territory, during its peak years, the same corridor that fed plantations across the whole northwest coast of the island. Descendants carrying the Palmer name out of St. James frequently carry that Igbo signal front and center. A name wrapped in ghost stories turns out to be pointing at a very real, very specific stretch of the Niger Delta. Number 13. Morgan is Welsh, and in Jamaica it drags a genuinely wild history behind it. Sir Henry Morgan, the pirate who terrorized the Spanish Main and later became the island's lieutenant governor, ended his career as a plantation owner in Clarendon Parish. Clarendon's registers show a trade pattern split between Gold Coast Akan captives in the early decades and a rising share of West Central African, Congo and Mbundu people as the 1700s wore on. That means Morgan descendants often carry a blended profile, Akan resilience layered with a deep Congo foundation, the same two threads that show up again and again once you start pulling Clarendon's records. A pirate's name, hiding two of the proudest African trade corridors side by side. Number 12, Dunbar. Dunbar is a Scottish place name from a coastal town in East Lothian, and it planted itself hard in Trelawney Parish, the same parish that borders the Cockpit country, home to the Trelawney Maroons, descendants of enslaved Africans who escaped and fought the British to a standstill for generations. Trelawney's estates leaned heavily on Coromantee captives, the British name for Akan people shipped out through the Gold Coast forts. That's not a coincidence. The Maroon Wars that made Cockpit country legendary were led overwhelmingly by Akan-descended resistance fighters, people whose military organization back home translated directly into guerrilla warfare in the Jamaican hills. Dunbar families out of Trelawney carry that same Gold Coast thread, a quiet Scottish place name sitting on top of some of the fiercest resistance ancestry the island ever produced. Number 11. Reed is Scottish, an occupational or descriptive name meaning red, likely referring to hair or complexion. It's spread wide across nearly every parish, which makes it a harder name to pin down, but its densest cluster sits in St. Anne, on the island's north coast. St. Anne's registers show a trade dominated by two very different sources over time. Early Gold Coast Akan captives, then a later heavier wave of Biafra Igbo captives as the North Coast sugar boom expanded. So Reed descendants from St. Anne often split down one of two roads, and DNA is the only thing left that can tell a family which road their own line actually walked. Number 10, Barrett. Barrett carries one of the most famous literary connections on this entire list. The Barrett family owned Cinnamon Hill Estate in St. James, and their fortune, built entirely on Jamaican sugar and enslaved labor, is what eventually funded the upbringing of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of the most celebrated poets of the Victorian era back in England. Cinnamon Hill's records point heavily toward West Central Africa, Congo and Angola, supplemented by Biafra Igbo captives. Black Jamaican Barretts today, many with no direct family connection to the poet at all, frequently carry exactly that blend, a literary fortune built on Central African and Igbo ancestry that never made it into a single verse of English poetry. Number 9, Brown. Brown is about as plain as surnames get. A description of hair or complexion spread across England and Scotland like wildfire, and that plainness is exactly why it's so easy to overlook what it's quietly carrying. Brown is scattered across every parish in Jamaica, but wherever it clusters densely, the registers behind it trace back overwhelmingly to West Central Africa, the single largest source of enslaved people brought to the island in raw numbers, decade after decade. The flattest, most forgettable name on this list turns out to be one of the strongest pointers straight at the Congo and Mbundu homelands. Number 8. Clerk. Clerk is an Old English occupational name for a clerk or scholar, someone who could read and write, back when that was rare enough to build an identity around. In Jamaica, it took root heavily in Portland, on the wetter, more isolated northeast coast. Portland's isolation shaped its trade pattern in an unusual way. Smaller estates, fewer large-scale purchases, but a notably high concentration of Bight of Benin captives, Yoruba and Fon people, whose spiritual and musical traditions left fingerprints all over Jamaican folk religion that survive to this day. Clark descendants out of Portland carry that Yoruba Fon thread disproportionately often, a scholar's name sitting on top of one of the most culturally influential regions in the whole trade. Number 7. Thompson, son of Thomas, spread everywhere the English language went, and Jamaica was no exception. It's common enough that it behaves less like a single arrow and more like a cross-section of the whole island's history. Pull 100 Jamaican Thompson families and you'll find Akan, Igbo, Congo and Yoruba ancestry all represented. If you carry it, don't assume your cousin's results will match yours. One Thompson line might trace to a Gold Coast fort, another to an Angolan port 1,000 miles south. Both would be completely right. Number 6, Blackwood. Blackwood is where the story shifts. It's an old Scottish topographic name, but on the island it also became something else entirely. A name some families chose for themselves after emancipation in 1838, deliberately picking a description that had nothing to do with the estate they'd been held on. Because it was often a chosen name rather than an inherited one, Blackwood doesn't point at one clean African region. Instead, it behaves like a fingerprint of the whole trade, gathered from families who came from every corner of the island's plantation system and decided, the moment they were free, to write their own first line of history. Number 5. Grant. Grant is another Highland Scottish clan name, and like Campbell, it rode into Jamaica on the back of the same wave of Scots who came to run, and often to own outright, the island's sugar economy. Grant estates concentrated in St. Mary Parish on the northeast coast. St. Mary's registers lean hard toward the Bight of Biafra with a steady secondary current from West Central Africa. Grant descendants out of that parish carry an Igbo-Congo blend that shows up again and again, a clan name from the Scottish Highlands sitting directly on top of two of West Africa's deepest wells. Number 4. Macdonald. Macdonald is possibly the single most recognizable Highland clan name in the world, and Jamaica absorbed an enormous number of them. Entire Macdonald branches settled across Hanover and Westmoreland, running estates on the island's western tip. That corner of the island pulled hard and consistently from the Gold Coast for most of the 1700s. Macdonald descendants from western Jamaica frequently carry a striking concentration of Akan ancestry, one of the most iconic Scottish surnames on earth, worn today by descendants of the Ashanti and Fante nations of modern Ghana, far more often than by anyone with a drop of Highland blood at all. Number 3. Bogle. Now we're into the true heavy hitters. Bogle is not a common English surname at all. It belonged to Paul Bogle, the Baptist deacon who led the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion in St. Thomas Parish, one of the defining uprisings in Jamaican history, and who was executed for it by the colonial government. Bogle himself was a free man of relatively unusual standing for his time, but the surname spread widely through St. Thomas among formerly enslaved families who lived through the rebellion and its brutal aftermath. St. Thomas's registers point overwhelmingly toward the Bight of Biafra, Igbo ancestry running through nearly the entire parish. A name that means resistance in Jamaican history books turns out to also mean Igbo, more often than not, when the DNA comes back. Number 2, Gordon. Gordon is Scottish, another Highland name, but in Jamaica it belongs first and foremost to George William Gordon, a mixed-race businessman and politician, the son of an enslaved woman and a Scottish planter, who was tried and executed alongside Paul Bogle after the Morant Bay Rebellion, despite thin evidence connecting him to the violence itself. Gordon's execution turned him into one of Jamaica's national heroes, and the surname carried by his descendants, and by the many unrelated families across St. Thomas and Kingston who share it, traces back through the same corridor as Bogle, heavy Bight of Biafra ancestry, with a strong secondary Gold Coast presence. Two names, tied together by the same rebellion, the same parish, and largely the same African homeland. There's one name left and it towers over everything on this list. Number 1, Marley. There is no close second. Marley is, statistically and culturally, the most Jamaican surname on earth, carried by a relatively small family network on the island, but known globally because of one man, Robert Nestor Marley, born in the rural district of 9 Mile in St. Anne Parish, to a black Jamaican mother and a white Jamaican father of British descent. St. Anne's Registers, the same parish we touched on with Reed, show that heavy layered pattern of Gold Coast, Akan ancestry, followed by a later dominant wave from the Bight of Biafra. Black Jamaican families carrying the Marley name overwhelmingly trace back through exactly that same corridor. Akan resilience, Igbo depth, the two threads that run under half of St. Anne's black population. So the single most famous Jamaican name in the world, a name that sang the whole island's suffering and its freedom back to itself, sits on top of the same Gold Coast and Biafran ancestry that built Cockpit Country's Maroon Wars and Morant Bay's rebellion. The music was never separate from the history. It came directly out of it. Closing. So the most famous name a Jamaican can carry turns out to trace, statistically, right back to the two African regions that shaped almost every act of resistance on this list. Bogle's rebellion, the Trelawney Maroons, the uprisings the planters spent 2 centuries trying to write out of the record. The surname only ever told you where the paperwork stopped. The 1817 registers are what's finally telling you where the family truly began. For most of Jamaican history, the plan was for this information to disappear completely. Between the old plantation ledgers, the triennial slave registers, and a DNA test that costs less than a night out, families are undoing in an afternoon what 2 centuries of erasure tried to make permanent. If you saw your name anywhere on this list, you already know what to do. Drop it in the comments with your family's parish, because that pairing is your starting coordinate. Subscribe so you're here for next week, when we go even deeper into the registers and the specific estates they lead straight back to. Your name has been trying to tell you something your entire life. It's about time somebody finally read it back to you.